Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for our third session in our Culture and Academic Medicine series. Just want to go ahead and introduce Dr. Nakai. Dr. Sunny Nakai is the Senior Associate Dean for Equity, Inclusion, Diversity, and Partnership, and the Professor of Medical Education at the California University of Science and Medicine, and the founder of Sunshine Medical Education Consulting. Dr. Nakai works with organizations to increase access, equity, representation, and well-being in medicine for historically excluded groups. She is dedicated to achieving inclusive institutional excellence through co-laboratory practices and partnerships. Her work is focused on translational and practical approaches, skills, and training that build individual and collective capacity for equity, belonging, and thriving. She develops and delivers training on enrollment management, mission-aligned processes, trauma and mitigation, cultural humility, agility, structural justice, anti-racism, healthcare provider and trainee well-being, and equity practice skills. And so we're going to go ahead and get started, but that is Miss Sunny Nakai.
Thank you, Naya. So I have very plain slides, and hopefully that is both good and bad. I haven't gotten around to making them more fancy. And this presentation is getting queued up for publication submission to MedEd Portal. And each of these different ones will be kind of broken out. So let's get started. So I want to talk about how dominant cultural norms manifest and what the impact of them are in professional work and learning environments, specifically in education. And then we'll talk about strategies for reshaping and mitigating those norms. I'm a fan of sort of giving options for how do we actually address the problem. I was not an unconscious bias training fan because I didn't feel like telling everyone that their brains were flawed and leaving it at that was very helpful. I think we actually need things that we can do to reshape or address when we recognize that that something is not in keeping with our values or inclusive excellence. So for our guidelines for today, please feel free to ask questions. You can put them in the chat or you can raise your hand or just come off mute and holler. It looks like it's going to be a small group, so that is completely fine. There might be discomfort or dissonance, and that's a normal part of the learning process. And I just invite you to mediate that for yourself if you need to pause, participating bravely and accepting non-closure, disagreement, and ambiguity, and then extending some grace and patience to yourself and your colleagues as we kind of go through some of these norms. We will not do them all. There are 26 of them that we have identified, at least thus far, and we're only going to do just a subset of them. So I'm going to use Slido today. It's interactive polling. It is anonymous. I won't store the data. It's not going to spam you later and ask you if you want to buy Girl Scout cookies or donate to a band fundraiser, etc. You only have to join the poll once, and then after you do, it will advance on your device or on the tab that you're using on your computer as integrated into the presentation. And you can skip or not answer questions as you like without rejoining. And again, it's completely anonymous. So it's like a shared whiteboard that we get to use that's integrated. So we can actually apply and think about how some of these things manifest in our environments and get a sense of the prevalence of this and what the impacts are. So this is kind of our warm-up question. This is a word cloud. So when you hear dominant culture, what comes to mind? When you saw the invite or the poster for this talk, what did you think that dominant culture means? What were some of the things that came to mind for you? And in the corner, we can also see like how many people have contributed to responding. So that's also helpful. And please holler or raise your hand if you're having difficulty joining the Slido. You can scan the QR code or you can go to slido.com and then put this join code in, and then it will allow you to join. So white, hierarchy, physician, men, power. Colonialism. Okay. Majority. prominent? Yeah, what are sort of our kind of norms or unspoken expectations and suppression? Okay, going to move on to the next question. Thank you. It looks like most people have figured out how to join, and you're all, if you're listening in and you're not able to type or participate safely, that's obviously also fine and welcome. Okay, so culture is both blueprints and builders. We often sort of look at our environment and the culture of our institutions as if it just always were there. In fact, it is not, right? It's how we communicate and relate to each other. It's what we think is normal or acceptable. And it's manifestations of actions of the past that shape the present and the future. So values in action, it's lived and felt, enacted and interpreted. So I'm sitting in an office right now, and there's a lot that it's contributing to my experience. There's lighting and the tone of that lighting. I can faintly hear the HVAC system. I have a window. There's electricity and all sorts of conduit running through the walls. Those are all contributing to me being able to sit at this computer, right? All of the cables that run through the ceiling. But I'm not seeing all of those things all the time, right? I also like to say that culture is shaped by event and not intent. And so what we declare about ourselves is not our culture. What we do in the wake of things that breach our values or that go against what we have professed is our culture is actually what our culture is, right? So if we want a culture of academic integrity, then how we handle instances where academic integrity is lacking actually is going to shape our culture, not our policy and what is written about academic integrity, right? And if I tell everyone that I'm a ballerina and I'm the principal ballerina for the New York Ballet, I will need to demonstrate that in some way in order to make that real, right? So we're going to go through some cases. These have been contributed by myself and colleagues, and I'll sort of name the dominant culture element that's present. Sometimes there's more than one, but we'll focus on one per case. And then I'll talk about mitigation strategies or everyday equity practices that can reshape some of these norms. And then you'll have an opportunity to sort of talk about impact or offer your discussion or thoughts via Slido or just live in the room if you're comfortable with that. So here's the first one. So the grant selection committee has 7 voting members, all of whom are white or Asian, none of whom identifies as female. The chair receives a complaint from a constituent that the diversity of the board is insufficient. So the chair decides to appoint an additional board member who's female and from an underrepresented minority group to the board as ex officio non-voting, and that solves the issue. This may or may not sound familiar to you. And this norm is tokenism. So when we focus on the composition of individuals at the table rather than equity practice for the entire committee, when we frame diversity, equity, and inclusion competencies and endeavors as work only suited or appropriate for minoritized, historically excluded, or marginalized groups, we believe that putting someone in the room solves the problem, right? Not addressing the dynamics of power that are present. We might appoint historically excluded, minoritized, or marginalized individuals to positions of unequal or untenable power, right? Making them ex officio or not giving them a budget, not giving them influence, having them report to someone that doesn't, in fact, have any kind of coverage for them within the institution. And then just assuming that people with minoritized or marginalized identities, whether you're assuming their identities or whether they've shared them, are automatically qualified for diversity, equity, and inclusion work, for the change work and justice work of equity and inclusion. My saying about this is that a cancer survivor is not an oncologist. I'm going to say that again. A cancer survivor is not an oncologist. My personal experience with something like oppression or racism, discrimination, is my personal experience and grants me insights and a unique lens and valuable lived and learned experiences. However, it does not equate to expertise, especially in an organizational or systemic level where a lot of change and accountability for change may be required. So, what are some examples or manifestations of tokenism that you've witnessed or experienced? How does tokenism show up in the work that we do? I'll start just, and this is a free text response, so you can just sort of type an answer and it'll scroll on the screen. The one that comes to mind for me is often when we are writing cases within the curriculum, there'll be sort of a token representation of a vulnerable group or a vulnerable identity that's kind of baked into the case. And either it has a very stereotypical role and is tokenized in that manner, or it's mentioned, but then nothing is actually done with it. It's not assessed. We don't talk about vulnerabilities or any of the contingencies or consideration for care or care plans relative to those vulnerable identities, right? So we sometimes, again, just like putting someone in the room solves the problem. Well, making this characteristic part of the case now makes it a diverse case, right? And how are we addressing or framing some of those things within our curriculum? I see that folks are typing. And again, feel free to come off mute and speak into the room. If there's anyone that's just joining us, the Slido is interactive, it's anonymous. You will not get any spam. I will not be saving it. It's just a shared whiteboard for this session. And you can join by scanning the QR code or opening a new tab on your browser and just going to slido.com and typing this join code. So it looks like folks are typing. There might be a delay. Another manifestation of tokenism that I think I've seen is making sure that there is a person of color on a search committee and not paying attention to any parts of the process or selection factors or alignment or any of the power dynamics relative to how that search potentially would take place. So here's an example, adding the DEI director, the DEI lead on the curriculum committee with no one else responsible for equity work. Yeah, it's a pretty tough position to be put in. Called into other disciplines to mediate concerns related to discrimination or bias without context. Yeah, I've had a lot of colleagues of color say, I went to school for, bajillions of years to become a pediatric cardiologist, and I'm being asked to do this thing relative to equity and inclusion and implementation of, process-specific diversity. And I don't want to say no to it because I'm really glad the institution is finally recognizing it. I'm also just wondering how my 0.003 of FTE that they're willing to dedicate and add on to my already crowded plate is going to make a difference, right? For outside funding or recognition, yeah, putting something on there. Oh, we just go need to find a partner that's this or that. We do a little bit of window dressing, being the sole voice on issues related to equity in healthcare policy, just because you studied it. Yeah, so the lack of integration or the lack of attention across the board. Women only given interim roles, men getting appointed to permanent positions. Yeah, it could definitely be, oh, we like the look of something, right? And there's going to be potential limitations when it's just at a tokenism level and not integrated. Black History Month, that's the time where you see the most lectures by Black people instead of year round. Yeah, we only see people as expertise in specific ways relative to what we assume their identities are, right? Rather than they could be giving a lecture on infectious disease or something completely different. Asked to step up to mentor women of color as a woman of color without any support. Yes, we're going to talk about that one as well. And spoiler alert, I do not call that a minority tax. I call that a majority subsidy, and we will definitely be talking about that norm. So how do we get past this? How do we reshape this? We focus on equity in policies, procedures, personnel, and workplace norms. We apply equity in specific, tailored, and intentional ways. What does that mean about each phase of a process or the way a committee operates, the norms that we establish? And we ask everyone to bring a certain level of awareness and attention to equity practice and everyone to build capacity for that, right? So we need to name tokenism when it shows up, right? Are we engaging in tokenism here? Or what are we hoping to gain by adding XYZ person to this committee? Step back and clearly define the problem before using representation to solve equity practice or a dominant cultural norm. right? If the problem is that we don't have enough representation from specific groups, right, then that's probably a process, power dynamic, culture issue as much as it is representation, right? And this is not to say that representation doesn't matter. It absolutely does. But we have to have equity practice as well, right? Otherwise, we actually can do some harm. We can provide training and capacity building for what equity practice looks like, right? The focus is on representation and practice. One of the surgical societies that I work with actually redid some of their bylaws around representation and specifically asked for lived and learned experiences relative to the populations and challenges that they were facing, instead of saying a minority person on this committee, right? A person on the committee that has lived and learned experience relative to sexual and gender minorities, relative to, race and ethnicity in medicine, relative to health disparities. Like, what are some of the specific things that we're looking for so that people know, oh yeah, I can do that. I can bring that to the committee. And they may or may not look stereotypically the way that everyone said, but if we're actually asking for that expertise and naming it, we're much more likely to get it than if we just apply an assumed label identity and then engage in tokenism. So, what are the impacts of tokenism? How does this, I think you all sort of were alluding to it in terms of leadership, right? It impacts what we're seeing. I've seen it set people up to fail, especially when a person does not want to say no to an institution's sort of willingness to try and address the problem. But again, not given a budget, not given sufficient time, and then blamed like, oh, well, we put so and so in charge of that, in charge of diversity for the entire curriculum committee. And if it's not done, it's that person's fault, right? So it sometimes even abdicates everyone else of the responsibility of saying, what's my role as someone who is delivering this curriculum, for example, to embed equity in what it is we're doing. Professional identities. Yeah. Feeling of failure. Yeah. Being subjugated and sidelined contributes to bigger feelings of marginalization, especially when you're the person who's wearing that hat and then you become routinely ignored. Oh, yeah. You're always going to say that you're the champion for blah, blah, blah. Right. Secondary bystander effect. Yeah. Other people don't take responsibility because they say, oh, well, this person over here is supposed to do it. And if they're not saying anything, then must be fine. Right. These are all really good responses. So, training seminar. During a training seminar, a participant asks a question about why certain elements of a program are necessary. The presenter responds sharply. That's a senseless question. Are you sure you're in the right place? It's an example of defensiveness. It can hinder decision making or learning by shutting down discussion when those in power respond poorly to ideas or opinions being challenged. The underlying cause of defensiveness is fear. And that could be to a prevailing notion that some people have more power than others, that power will be diminished, and defensiveness erodes psychological safety. So, do you witness defensiveness at your institution, in your institutional context? To what extent do you agree that you witness defensiveness within your institution? Give folks a few more seconds to respond. I think we have all definitely seen this and recognizing that it is coming from a place of fear, right? People feel attacked. They somehow want to defend themselves, right? Have this impulse to defend themselves. Okay, so most of you agree or strongly agree that you see defensiveness. So how do we mitigate this? We can normalize point and counterpoint dialogue. Something like saying, I would like 3 reasons why this is a terrible idea before we move forward, right? And just making that part of the norm so that it isn't such an uphill task to challenge something or to look at the opposite of something. Invite different opinions, share power by taking turns leading the session, name defensiveness when it shows up, ask everybody to work on it. take a pause when defensiveness shows up, like, wow, I'm feeling really defensive. I know this is important. I'm just going to take 5 and come back to this, ready to commit to whatever it is that we need, right? We can create more safety by using masked processes. Sometimes there's hierarchy that gets in the way of people feeling safe bringing something up. And again, like naming defensiveness and asking folks to work on it, right? Recognize when you're feeling defensive, when you're feeling that fight urge, and to step back and really try to mitigate it. So, how does defensiveness impact our learning environments? And we can also say clinical environments and teaching environments. Um, I have seen in the classroom, professors exhibit defensiveness when students ask questions. There will be no more questions asked after defensiveness shows up, right? Because the students are like, "Oh, I don't want to be the person who gets shut down," right? Yeah, it models poor behavior. In a clinical setting, it can increase errors because people are afraid to ask questions, are afraid to bring something up, might not want, to be scorned. It can lead to a fixed mindset. Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot around patient safety, and defensiveness, and patient safety and psychological safety, right? And so a lot of these norms portend to creating environments of psychological safety. And if providers and learners in the clinical environment don't have safety, it's pretty hard for them to provide that for patients. Yeah, it makes people feel uncomfortable. It impacts teamwork, can impact handoffs and questions and the coordination of care. Yeah, people can get a reputation. So maybe something happens once and they get a reputation for being that way, and the environment starts to be shaped around some of that harshness. All right, this case, no apology. A female resident is openly berated by the attending of mishandling a patient's treatment, although the actual mistake was made by the junior male resident. He then remarks that women should not be in the specialty in front of the team. Once the actual facts of the case are shared with the attending, he does not apologize nor make restitution for his comments to the resident or the team. So this is appearance over authenticity. The investment in appearance of total infallibility or confidence in professional settings, not leaving space to admit flaws, missteps, or mistakes, not apologizing, especially to subordinates, and a culture where mistakes are evidence of failure, right? We put more investment in the appearance of something than in authenticity. How does appearance over authenticity manifest in your environment? I don't know if this one got screwed up. This poll does not look like it's working. So give that a thought. I will tell you, one of my colleagues at another medical school wanted to have a food pantry in their medical school, similar to what we have at CUSM, and was told by the administration that it was, quote, a bad look to have at this elite medical school a food pantry for students. So an investment over the appearance of what it looks like to have students with need versus actually a commitment to meeting student need, right? And it shows up quite a bit in how we dress things up sometimes. I think it undermines a lot of trust as well. So, how do we do this? We can model openness and apology. We can learn from mistakes. We can allow people to be vulnerable with each other and model vulnerability. Encourage that in discussions, questions that are reflective, like what was the hardest thing about this case, right? What is something that you know now that you didn't know yesterday? And giving folks an opportunity to share. Have people take turns sharing their stories so we can know more about each other outside of what we're doing. And in the learning environment, who we are and that sense of belonging and authenticity is as important as what we're learning and how we're learning those things. And so it's up to leaders to model that. I had an attending that my students loved when I was at Loyola that had an award for the mistake of the day. And it was the mistake of the day that led to the most learning. And so at the end of each day, it would be like, congratulations, this person. And sometimes he would award it to himself, right? But here's what we learned with this thing, right? And really modeling that, hey, that's okay. And it's okay to be vulnerable as a learner. You're not going to be canceled if you make a mistake. So, some everyday equity practices around authenticity, a framework for team discussions that enables feedback regularly. If you've ever done like highs and lows, or hopes and fears, or roses and thorns, that's an easy one. Everyone's sharing one thing that they know and one thing they don't. It could be something about the case itself, or it could be something just about life, or something in the kitchen, or something different. I like to do accolades and apologies, which sort of normalizes that as we work together, we tend to bump up against each other quite a bit, and apologies might be necessary very often. So I have the following accolades to offer my colleagues and the following apologies to offer. You can also use continue, stop, start, and sorry as sort of a team round robin. What should we keep doing? What's really working? What should we stop doing? What should we start doing? What are some ideas about how could improve it? And are there any sorries that we need to be that need to be offered for the sake of teamwork, safety, and better patient care? Starting a diversity committee. You want to start a diversity committee to tackle bias and discrimination. The department leadership doesn't really believe that there's a problem. They see this as making trouble and creating conflict in the department. Finally, you manage to get this diversity committee started and present next steps. And you're asking for things like a budget and maybe some staff support. And leadership says, you've got a committee, that's enough. So this is an example of power hoarding. We don't put a lot of structures around sharing power. We're pretty invested in hierarchy, and hierarchy as norm is also another dominant cultural norm. But power within the team is seen as fixed and limited, right? So if we create more power structures, we ourselves become less powerful. Those with power are threatened and take it personally when others propose changes or start new things. They don't see themselves as hoarding power, right? And they don't see themselves as feeling threatened. They assume that they know best. And people who ask for change or who question can be labeled as ill-informed or naive or angry or inexperienced. And this is just one of the ways that power begins to be concentrated within cultures that then can lead to lots of blind spots and poor outcomes. I don't know why my Slido is now not working. Slide is, let's see. So reasons for power hoarding. Why would power hoarding be a norm? Let's give you a second to either think about that or come off mute. One of my colleagues also said that in early survival, one of the reasons for hierarchy is protection of the vulnerable, right? Survival and protection of the vulnerable. And so it's leadership's job to actually protect vulnerable folks. It gets pretty turned on its head sometimes. I saw a comment from Elizabeth, tradition. Yeah, tradition is the big one for the more power you have, right? Then must be the best. So how do we fix this? Oh, insecurity. Yes. Thanks, Monica. Um, Regular provide opportunities for new ideas and change making among the team. Be explicit about power dynamics. Power is always present whether we acknowledge it or not. And turns out that the more power you have, the less you think about it. And the least amount of power you have, the more that you think about it. So students, residents, and trainees are acutely aware of all of the ways that they don't have power within the system, right? Junior faculty are more aware of power dynamics than senior faculty, et cetera. So we can name that power dynamic in order to tame it and sort of calm it down. We can provide opportunities for anonymous feedback, consider co-leadership, rotating leadership, or framing leadership as a process instead of leadership as a position. And then how do we rotate power within a group, right? Having term limits is a big one. Other structures in place to distribute power. Once upon a time, Mayo Medical School had a 3-year time limit for leadership positions. So people entered those positions knowing that they had 3 years. They could be extended by necessity for up to 3 more years, but 6 years was the maximum that a person could occupy a position as a chair or clerkship director. And that did a couple things, encouraged people to share and help other folks get up to speed, and also let people who were in those positions have a mindset that eventually they would not be. right? And so, how could they share and create structures that would encourage continuity rather than sort of bake them into the infrastructure in perpetuity? How do we create shared decision making in the learning process and reinforcing a culture that values all opinions? We can also champion specific ways that folks across the hierarchy have made important contributions to a project or an aim or an endeavor. So again, encouraging leadership as a process, as an everyday equity practice. Um, Even just having people sit in different spots, right? Who always sits at the head of the table? Who always sits around the outside? What if a new person started the meeting, or what if we took turns starting the meeting or taking notes, especially if there isn't an assigned person to take notes and we're doing it on a volunteer basis? Um, there could be a resident leadership rotation, right? Where sort of in each year, you rotate through these roles. You're on the selection committee, you're on an interview committee, you're the noon conference chief, you're the medical education chief. How can we create more roles that actually allow leadership to be a process of teamwork rather than a named position that equals hierarchy and title? Here's rounds and rotations. Jamari and Doug are the only two Black men in their large medicine program. Jamari was late for morning rounds only once due to car trouble, but was given feedback about professionalism and punctuality on his mid-rotation report. His colleague Marty is often late, so much so that his nickname is Tardy Marty, but Marty's report does not mention punctuality. When the rotation is over, Jamari reviews his evaluations and sees that he was evaluated for procedures he has not yet done by faculty he hasn't worked with, only to find out that Doug's evaluations had been assigned to him. This is actually a real case. So this norm is undifferentiated and hypervisible, and this is a representation problem. Underrepresented and historically excluded individuals can be scrutinized and noticed more because they stand out more in the environment, right? They can be held to a different standard, either consciously or subconsciously. They may be latently or blatantly considered ambassadors for their groups, and being routinely mistaken for others sharing similar qualities and characteristics is really common. And in an evaluation system that's incredibly subjective, that does not feel very safe to believe that your flaws will be universally assigned to everyone who might even closely resemble you, and that your strengths may not be specifically assigned to you, right? And it may be a product of identity or context or both. And often this is not intentional, but it contributes to a lot of harm within a training environment and for psychological safety and also for patient care. Do you see undifferentiated and hypervisible norms at your institution? Do you think that folks have maybe more difficulty differentiating folks from certain backgrounds than others? Are you routinely mistaken for someone else who might present similarly to you? Um, what does that look like at your institution? Yeah, so most of you agree or strongly agree. So a big one here is to apply some conscientiousness to this. Practice saying names, correcting names, and checking names regularly to make sure that you're getting it right. Disrupt assumptions and disrespectful name practices. So if you don't remember, ask. Use photo rosters and include pronouns. That can also be helpful. And have some clear policies there and follow through on them equitably. We can also mitigate by recognizing that there can be amplification due to small sample sizes. So if a person is what my colleague Bonnie calls the only and lonely within their program, we need to take that into consideration when we look at their evaluations. We can anticipate bias and sort of course correct by having some clear evaluation forms and policies. And then how do we incorporate name practice? We can use table tents when we're sitting in the classroom so that people have name associated with a face more often. We can have bigger name badges that specifically say what people's roles are. And a lot of this overlaps with patient safety as well. So our MBS faculty here at CUSM has a cohort of 60, and they all sit down and practice pronouncing the new cohort's names before orientation and routinely use table tents in the classroom, at least for the first semester, so that everyone can get to know the students and each other really well. So, also, it's okay to be imperfect in this, and it's important to apologize if you make a mistake. And so I usually say something like, I strive for inclusive practice for names and pronouns. I'm committed to learning your name and saying it correctly and using your pronouns, and asking people to correct me if I don't get it right. And I sometimes will even say to students, if I meet your family on graduation and they pronounce your name totally differently than I've been pronouncing it for 4 years, I'm going to be really offended. Like I want to get your name right. It's really important to me. It's really important to me that I do that in an affirming way. There's also all sorts of phonetic guides and name drops. People have that on LinkedIn. There's like little clicks that say, hear my name. Sometimes sending a voice note or pasting a voice note into your address book can also be really helpful in remembering how to say someone's name. And I sometimes will put a phonetic note in my contacts in my phone, so I can remember like where the accents go to say someone's name correctly, because it is really important. And when names are unfamiliar, it takes extra effort. But I can tell you that nobody knows how to spell Mike Krzyzewski, right? One of the coaches that retired from Duke. But everyone says that name correctly. And it actually starts with KZ, right? So we can do it. It's just, this is actually about power and familiarity and effort, right? Who is important enough to speak their name correctly or to recognize their face and their name, and who is not? Case to present research. All of your team members successfully completed their research projects, and now your program has the opportunity to send individuals to a research conference to present. You invite all but one team member to present, citing they may be not comfortable in the conference environment and probably won't be able to travel because they have small children. This is an example of paternalism. So often very positively motivated and well-meaning, a tendency of authority to protect people they judge as marginal or inferior or in need of protection through a projection of assumption of negative outcomes. And that forecloses opportunity, right? We don't ask. We think that we know what's best for people. What if this person isn't successful? What if they fail? I don't want them to do poorly. Let's wait, rather than letting folks give their own self-appraisal or have an opportunity to apply or say no. How does paternalism manifest at your institution? What might paternalism look like? Some folks are typing. Yeah, I think with students, especially in student affairs, we end up not sending something out really broadly. We end up kind of deciding which people we think would be interested or would be best suited. And maybe we don't know all of the aspects or the interests or talents of everyone who's in our orbit. Yeah, sometimes we don't offer leadership positions to people, right? Just assume that they wouldn't want it or they probably don't want to do it. And a lot of those processes are not open the way that they should be. Showing vulnerability is weaponized against some groups. Yeah, absolutely. So if you show vulnerability or authentic in some ways, then that gets translated as weak, right? And then you need protection, or we're not going to do XYZ because a person is fragile. Um, Speaking for students, yeah, assuming from someone's background, making decisions without input. Yeah, well, this is going to be the best, or if we have to cut this, then I'll just choose what I think is um, the most appropriate thing, rather than actually talking to folks about what they need, right? Using nonverbal communication, that's a really good one as well. Yeah, just not being explicit about it, assuming, well, the person was standing in the back, or they were looking aside, or they were looking at their phone, right? Maybe they had an emergency in that exact moment and they're super interested, but we've inferred things that disqualify someone. So how do we fix this? So we focus on equity, mission, and learning goals rather than preventing negative outcomes. We have to treat people as individuals, not ambassadors for their group, and not make assumptions about their identities, their goals, their abilities. We need to name paternalism when it shows up and curb discussions that discuss potential outcomes. A big one for students is like having a lot of debt. Well, we should just dismiss them now because if they try for another year and they don't pass, they're going to have all this debt. They're not going to have a way to pay it back. And they're adults and they're asking for another opportunity to earn an MD, right? So how do we sort of figure that into honoring someone's agency in that way? And again, keep the discussions on whether someone's meeting milestones, how we're supporting them, and not make sort of conjecture around future outcomes or choices. What are the impacts of paternalism on learning, career, and work relationships? How might this show up in our career relationships? Being selected as someone who has potential versus not, right? Yeah, loss of opportunities, stunting career growth, and even sometimes things that we don't even find out about. It definitely can breed animosity and increase maybe competition or resentment, narrowing perspectives. And I think it really narrows the scope of talent as well when we just assume what people's abilities and interests are rather than do it more openly. Um, pits underrepresented folks against other folks that are underrepresented. Yeah, if certain people are always chosen versus not, and there's assumptions made about their abilities. Yeah. Conversations about racism. Dr. Elodie is a health equity champion and often brings up issues of race during grand rounds or department meetings. Dr. Javed is uncomfortable with her questions and states, "You're always bringing up race and it upsets people. This conversation is what's holding us back. Our department needs to be united. We need to move forward, not backward." Maybe you have heard a version of this before. This is called flipping the script. So it is sort of conferred as if you talk about racism, then you are racist, right? If you name sexism, then you are the source of the sexism, right? Conversations about diversity or difference are causes of division, discord, and contribute to the problem. Talking about the problem is the problem, right? This is a way that folks get really silenced because of the discomfort sometimes that comes up when we talk about and name oppression. The Slido also doesn't want to work. Flipping the script can manifest in our institutions. Again, people saying that this makes everyone uncomfortable. This is a source of division. This is a source of conflict. That you're making everything contentious, right? Um, and when we don't talk about oppression, it reinforces the status quo, right? When we don't talk about oppression, it makes it unsafe for people experiencing oppression to be part of our culture, right? And we can't change or disrupt what we don't name or discuss or acknowledge. And so when, again, gaslighting those conversations on racism, oh, you're just making this up, right, can make our places and spaces inherently unsafe and can be unsafe by proxy as well, in that secondary or tertiary effect where I witness someone being shut down, I hear about someone being shut down later, really can shape our culture. So separate the message from the messenger and make noticing and naming a part of our culture and practice. It's everyone's job to notice, name, and disrupt and call out these forces that often show up as sort of baked into our systems and processes and disrupt conversations that vilify colleagues for naming oppression, right? A person says, I think this has a long history of being sexist. And someone goes, "Oh, you're always saying that." And we say something like, we're always bringing it up because it's valid. It's still valid, right? It's still important. What would we need to change so that we don't have to have this conversation again? So here's an everyday equity practice. I call it listening without demand. Often the discomfort of talking about oppression is being made to feel as though you are singularly responsible for it and for fixing it, right? And so we feel to blame or responsible. step back and recognize that we can name, acknowledge, and recognize harm, and it may not be our responsibility to fix it. In fact, it does a lot about our culture of inclusion to acknowledge, name, and recognize harm, period. Right. And so we do need to deeply listen, right? And folks who are raising those issues, job one is to validate that this is real and that it's important. And it is a point of connection and being able to move forward to acknowledge these things as a first step. And it's okay to name that it's uncomfortable. It's okay to name that it's painful. It's okay to name that not everyone sees it in the same way. Um, Shutting it down definitely is a dominant cultural norm that does not set us up for inclusive excellence. All right. Sexist remarks. A male colleague openly makes a sexist statement to a female administrator in front of the team. No one says anything due to fear of impending conflict that would likely arise when holding a colleague accountable. It is that sort of moment in a committee meeting. I actually was sitting in a committee meeting and someone, went off on another person, and it was quite sexist and inappropriate. And I think everyone was just in a state of complete shock in that moment, right? And this is fear of open conflict. We have difficulty with disagreement or debate. Conflict is experienced as negative, right? And so honest discussion is much more difficult. And then for folks who have other aspects of their identities, they might be more likely to be viewed as causing conflicts rather than the things that they're bringing up being part of the problem. So we can practice disagreement and debate. Again, just randomly dividing into groups and doing more than one round and saying, okay, this is the pro group, this is the con group, take 5 minutes, report out, then switch, right? And give everyone an opportunity to look across that entire spectrum. Framing conflict as opportunity, right? What is the next right and best thing right now? And if this comes up again, that might change. Disrupt people who are vilified for naming things or bringing things up that are perceived as causing conflict. And again, assigning roles to the team and affirming courageous conversations, right? This is a difficult conversation. This is a courageous conversation. We're gonna hang in. If we need to pause, we will, right? And being able to just name even some of the discomfort that comes up from conflict and the importance of it, because often there's something really important in disagreement that requires our attention. What are the impacts of fear of open conflict on patient safety or learner safety? What do you think? Yeah, not speaking up, questions not being asked, right? Especially in the classroom when I've seen it where a student is asking a lot of questions and a peer of that student will get mad at that student, right? Stop asking all your questions, and that definitely creates a sense of fear and lack of safety. It can become toxic. Yeah, people try to hide and sort of blend into the woodwork. Yeah, this models poor behavior, right? How do we model? What do we do? How do we lean into conflict? Um, the silence can be violence. Yeah, the lack of psychological safety causes harm, and learning becomes really ineffective or sometimes just impossible when there isn't safety. And patients often can pick up on a lack of cohesion among the team or conflict or a lack of safety. Absolutely. Sexual and gender minorities. The PI is asked by sponsored project committee to collect data on race, ethnicity, first-gen status, gender identity, and sexual identity for all study participants as part of a university-wide reporting initiative. The PI sends only the race and ethnicity data, stating that the other data makes her feel uncomfortable and perhaps this data should not be collected at all. So this is right to comfort. And it's this notion that those in power have right to emotional and psychological comfort at all times. We might avoid difficult discussions. We might respond by citing cases where other forms of oppression are worse, right? Sort of, what about this group or what about that group? And just demonstrating opposition to anything that causes discomfort. And this is a norm, right? There is a psychological norm around not making folks who are above you in the hierarchy uncomfortable, right? Because uncomfortable can mean that is unsafe. Do you witness or experience a right to comfort in your institution? Do you think that leaders have sort of an inherent or latent expectation that they be kept comfortable or that they not deal with discomfort? All right, so a couple of you agree. Yeah, this is a tough one. When you have to go and give someone bad news, right? Or figure out how to address something that is just uncomfortable, right? It's very challenging. So the first thing is that if you're not uncomfortable, then you should question it and think about what are the relative levels of comfort, right? Sometimes I like to ask folks how much time they spent deciding what they were going to wear. And that can vary based on how socially comfortable people are. And people might think about, well, when I sit down, this skirt does this, and I don't like that, and blah, blah, blah. If you have a daughter like mine who has a very neurodivergent brain, she spends a lot of time thinking about all of the implications of how she will present and all of that. And I don't tend to think about that as much, right? So leaning into opportunities of discomfort. I'm noticing some discomfort. What is that telling us right now? Right? I'm feeling uncomfortable. I just want to pause. I don't even know what to do with that, but I'm feeling uncomfortable. The times that I've done that, everyone has unanimously said, "Oh my gosh, me too." And it's a really good opportunity to just pause and say, "Where is this coming from? Or what needs attention here?" And when discomfort is coming up, so we can even try to normalize it and embrace it. All right, so noticing and naming. Again, noticing and naming what's happening, if there's fear or discomfort, and then how might the situation be viewed differently, or what would make this possible? What would make this more comfortable, right? Sometimes thinking about the opposite can also be really helpful in moving us forward. Men in STEM. Jonathan submits a request for funding for a men in STEM group that he is starting. He feels that since there's a group on women in medicine and science, there should be one for men. Jonathan says not having a group for men is discrimination against him. True story, y'all. True story. So, how is this a dominant cultural norm? I call this one dedicated space or protected space as oppression. So, claiming that a dedicated or protected space is discrimination, right? Taking an ahistorical or decontextual lens that ignores oppression, exclusion, differential resource distribution, ignoring all of the social, political, and environmental context of our work, right? The way that I describe this is our lived and learned experiences, identities, and intersections determine whether or not we might benefit from having a dedicated or a protected space. And I don't think people who are not suffering from substance use disorder are beating down the doors of Alcoholics Anonymous saying, you're not including me, right? And if you go to a, fertility loss support group, you're not engaging in discrimination against people who have not experienced that, right? And so it's again goes back to Kamara Jones' principle of resources according to need, right? And what determines that need is often a product of a lot of historical and contextual, social and political determinants within our institutions and within society. So, have you experienced some examples of dedicated space as oppression? Did you have people saying things like, when is it Men's History Month, right? Or aspects of not fully understanding what it means to have resources according to need. And when I have students who come to me and say, so and so is getting this and I'm not, and it's unfair. And I will ask them what their needs are and what needs they have that are not being met that I can meet for them. me not giving another person what they need or taking something away from another person is not actually going to meet your needs any better, right? So what needs do you have that are not being met? And we can have that conversation, not one about fairness being equivalent to equity, because it's not, right? So I think we're doing okay on time. Maybe we'll go ahead and skip this one. Again, recognize the importance of space in belonging, resources according to need. Attend to those intersections of identity and power and presence that impact experiences. Even sometimes as a student affairs dean, spaces that needed to just be students only, right? Where my presence as a dean, administrator, and faculty member represented a disruption of space that was needed to be protected for students, for their experience as students that was unique to them. And another person's protected space does not oppress you. And again, what are the vulnerabilities that exist? What needs do you have that you're not being met? We need integrated spaces where we share across those things, and we often need protected spaces, again, because of the historical and contextual aspects of our institution that mean that we're having different experiences, right? We're experiencing the institution differently by how much of ourselves, what we care about, and our values are present within the institution and its culture. I'm going to skip that one for time's sake. So building transparency. So transparency builds trust. And this is really important. So when we write announcements and notifications, we use language that respects all audiences, including those to whom you might be speaking. So it's okay to share the purpose of groups or scholarships or initiatives and being clear about membership or participation or support, and looking at resources collectively across the institution rather than any one resource being a source of exclusion. So as we look across our student groups, are there ways for students of all identities and intersections, lived and learned experiences to engage, or is something missing? When I was a student affairs dean, some of our student events had alcohol and some of them did not, because it was important for us to be inclusive. We didn't have all of them not, and we didn't have all of them have, right? Some of them were great for families and some of them weren't. And across the calendar, it was really important to have that level of inclusion. We just sent out an invitation for a first gen pre-orientation program that some of my students here at CUSM are doing for the first time. And the beginning of the email says, you're receiving this email because you indicated first gen on your AMCAS application, right? We're transparently telling you why you got this email and so that maybe also got into this school did not. And we can also say something like, if another person that you know that's also coming to CUSM would benefit from this program, please have them contact us, right? We're more than happy to include them. We know that this data that we've used may not actually encompass everyone that we're trying to reach with this program. And then we share the purpose of the program, right? Learning some hidden rules, feeling a little bit more prepared to start, understanding there are some unique challenges to being a first generation in medical school, so that actually helps people understand, oh, okay, I get what that's for, right? And I try to write announcements so that when everyone reads them, they land, right? Not, oh, this should only be read by this group, or we're going to talk about that group in something, because that doesn't actually build trust or transparency. And it is not best practice for how we do dedicated spaces either. Uneven expectations. Your new cohort of lab interns is 3 months into their first year. Expected mistakes have been reported back to you from faculty. However, you're notified more frequently about the progress and mistakes of one intern, Natasha, more than others. You relay this information to your department at the next education committee meeting. You receive a text from Natasha that she was asked to leave the lab by a postdoc who said her hairstyle, locks, was not professional and did not meet the dress code. So this is an example of perfectionism, could also be undifferentiated, right? Focusing on mistakes and flaws of some more than others, or having a very different standard. We might expect people to fit a specific mold or a norm based on their personality or based on their interest or behavior or appearance. We might just engage in a lot of looking for errors constantly and nitpicking on things rather than focusing on growth. And sometimes this amounts to labeling and not forgiving past mistakes in performance or behavior. And this often ends up being a differential standard standard for the small n, whether that's women, whether that's students who came from X university versus Y university, etc. So perfectionism definitely shows up as a norm. And I'm also going to skip this one because I want to make sure we have time to get through the rest of these and still have some discussion. So again, focusing on growth, affirming diversity and excellence. We come to the table with different things, different lived and learned experiences, different backgrounds relative to what we're doing. Every day can be a clean slate, right? Every new start to a class or a clerkship is an opportunity to begin again, and highlighting the positives can go a long way. And again, one of my colleagues has a bias breakers technique where in their clinical competency committee for residents, before they talk about challenges that any resident is having, they do have discussion on what the trainees' strengths are before they begin talking about limitations. And I think it's such an important practice to be able to say, before we do this, we will talk about their strengths or the growth or the positives that we're seeing. Then let's talk about where their growth areas might need to be. And better yet, if we do that for every single one of our trainees, rather than just focusing on only a few that we think are the problem. A lot might come up in ways that we could support trainees if we just use that same template for every single one of our students. What are they doing well? Where do they need improvement? What's our action plan? And do that for everyone. Here's a great equity practice from Ruchika Tulsian, whose book is the name of the book is escaping me at the moment. But she calls it flip it to test it. So you apply the criteria to someone from another group or identity, and would your decision or norm or appraisal change, right? Do I apply this? What am I not seeing? And so we had a faculty member saying that one of our students was unprofessional because you could see like part of their chest through their shirt, and said we think that our dress code should include that you have to wear some sort of bra. We need to add that to the dress code. And we said, okay, but how are we going to differentiate like who that is inappropriate for, right? So if you're male presenting or male identified, does that also apply? We could flip it and say, does this also work for male presenting, male identified people? Probably not. And it's not something that we also feel is reasonable to try and enforce or police on our campus. Another really good example is in an admissions committee when the committee was talking about a student who grew up as a native Spanish speaker and majored in Spanish in college. And one of the committee members was like, yeah, I mean, she has good grades, but like, she majored in Spanish and she grew up speaking Spanish. And another committee member said, I was an English major and I grew up speaking English. Does that mean that my grades are like invalid, right? And then we all went, oh, because flipping it around helps us understand it a little bit differently. So flip it to test it. Good strategy. Here's another one. You've got 853 applications for 10 postdoc spots. You set your program selections as you routinely have, right? School reputation and grades, exam scores, prestigious letters, and your department has made a commitment to diversifying trainees, and you notice that you only have 5 Latinx interviewees selected. And the requests are going out tomorrow, and like there's just not enough time to add more parameters or to go back and review more applications in order to ensure that there's more diversity in the pool according to your commitment. So this is sense of urgency or time limits. And this is a big one. And we do a lot sometimes in making excuses, and often this is very valid. And I think two things or more things, multiple things can be true about urgency and time limits. But often it's difficult to be inclusive or to follow consistent protocol when things are time limited, right? We get discussion truncated or we have things to do. And so we shut down thoughtful exchange because there is urgency. We've all maybe been in a committee meeting where we think, man, if we'd had, 10 more minutes to discuss this candidate, we might have gotten to a place where we were able to see more of their strengths. But because we ended so prematurely, the outcome was different. So I'm going to skip that one as well. So if time is limited, again, consider rotating with questions, process presenting cases, do the most difficult things first so that really important stuff, most important and most difficult things first when everyone's attention is best and time is not fleeting. And don't be afraid to postpone things if you are able to. Often the deadlines that we have or the things we have to get through are imposed by us. And so being able to say, I think this is important enough that we should be revisiting it, right? I don't want urgency to be a huge factor in how we move forward with this policy decision or with this hiring decision, can be really important. So, a couple things to deal with urgency. Punt, which is make a reservation to deal with it later. There might be something really important that comes up during rounds or during a very stressful clinical encounter. Just being able to say, let's talk about this later. Don't let me forget. Or, hey, when we get to noon conference, let's chat about this. Can be really helpful because sometimes urgency even can prevent us from acknowledging it because we don't have time in the moment to fix it. So making a commitment to revisit some of those things. And again, giving us permission to not know in the moment, right? We could say something like, I'm really tempted to skip over this because I don't know. And so I'm going to go figure it out and I'll have an answer tomorrow, right? And that could be really helpful, especially if you're in an up power position and you want an opportunity to revisit something. The winners of the leadership awards are announced. Dr. Palmer is disappointed she was not selected. The awards carry a 15 grand bonus and are considered a strong element in promotion. She asked for feedback on her nomination as well as information about the process and how the winners were selected. She's scolded by a colleague who states that asking is inappropriate and demonstrates a lack of respect for her colleagues. How dare you ask how this was done? And this is an example of closed doors and processes. And we love this in academia. In the name of, I don't know, privacy and confidentiality, often we keep a lot of things very opaque when they should be transparent, right? And we're expected to accept outcomes without any information or verifications. If you question outcomes, you could be considered rude or suspicious or aggressive. Only people in power are allowed to know processes and things that happen behind closed doors, and that also keeps a lot of other folks in the dark, right? One of my colleagues just went up for promotion at her institution and was told, "Here are the invitations we sent out to get your peer letters," right? And was given the names, and she was not allowed to know who actually returned her letters or not. And like, well, I can't tell you who submitted a letter for you and who didn't. Why, right? Like it's pretty difficult to manage your career if you don't know sort of who came through and who didn't. And often there's very good reasons for anonymity. And often we use it because we just don't routinely practice transparency, right? Closed doors and the closed process is a norm. What would it look like if we told everyone what the rubric was? What would it look like if we did that, right? We would subject our decisions to some level of scrutiny, and often folks in power don't want that, right? So closed doors is the norm. So share the process, share the rubric, share the qualification data, strive for transparency and decision making as much as possible. Audit policies and norms when you can, and actively value process input and engagement. And feedback as a norm for growth is also really important. And understanding like how decisions and outcomes are perceived. Often when we have closed doors, people's story that they tell themselves about what's happening is really different than what actually is happening. One of the things I used to do as an admissions dean is invite anybody who served on the admissions committee in another capacity besides selection to silently observe. They had to sign a, non-disclosure, but to silently observe the proceedings of the executive admissions committee. Because absent actually being able to see it in action, people believe that all sorts of things happen, right? And it was really, really instructive for students, for folks who were reviewing to see how portions of the application were used in discussion, and also to look at how the process was really anchored in values, right? And things that they assumed were happening were not happening. And so whenever possible, practicing transparency can build trust. Here's our mentoring case, a new mentoring program within the organization, and assigns the only woman on the leadership team to mentor 3 women students, and the men on the team are not assigned any mentees, or they have only one mentee. So this is entitlement to emotional labor subsidy, right? A minority tax or majority subsidy. Not taking ownership of those things, supporting or coaching or being present for groups perceived as other. Often identity congruent mentoring is important, but there are lots of other different ways of mentoring and sponsoring and supporting, and that is a lot of labor, right? So sometimes we just routinely expect individuals from historically excluded or minoritized, marginalized groups, they're going to do the caretaking and the development of the colleagues and even our patients from those groups, right? Students on clerkships report if they are a heritage speaker of Spanish or Tagalog or Cantonese, they're routinely pulled all the time to do that and might miss out on other opportunities that are important to them, because they end up sort of serving as a, de facto interpreter on their clerkships, right? And so not only does that happen, but we don't value the time, expertise, and effort of that, right? We're not able to quantify what this actually contributes to the academy, and it ends up being a detriment often to take on folks and support them and mentor them. So, how can we actively value this? We need to put it on our promotion and tenure. I did submit for my promotion letters from four of my mentees that I worked with for many years. I felt like they were very well positioned to talk about my commitments and the contributions that I've made to their careers. And it's not required. Right. It's not required that you if you put mentoring as something that you're doing, that you submit letters. We need to ask about capacity and interest and commitment, right? And resist assumptions and monolithic assumptions about people's identities or their groups. So recognizing that emotional labor and maybe even protecting some time or creating policies and compensation or norms that sustain the value of emotional labor, right? And everyone should be engaging in the work of supporting historically excluded, minoritized, and marginalized groups. And we can do that with training and capacity building that shift that norm. All of the students belong to all of the faculty. And we try to sort of embody a no wrong door policy at CUSM, which means, taking responsibility for shepherding someone who comes to your door, even if you're not exactly the person who is equipped to manage it, right? A soft handoff to the right person, so that we don't bounce people around is a really important part of our culture. All right, I'm gonna skip these last two, but this one is just about data neglect, right? We don't bother to collect that data, or we purposely avoid collecting it because we don't want to know what it will reveal. We hide behind legal guidelines or other things to do bare minimums, or we're uninvested in data-driven frameworks that might disrupt the status quo, right? So there's a lot of politics and gatekeeping around data. And then it also comes in as data demand, right? So policies relative to data are important, especially when we need it for equity, and make data informed practice mandatory, right? And investing in some data infrastructure is also really important. And then this one would be that we then demand data. Before we will do anything about something that is reported to us as wrong, we need more evidence of that happening, or we don't know that that's actually real, even though folks from the community or faculty or students are telling us that this thing is very real, right? And so we do this on both sides by not collecting data, and then we do it by also ignoring or selectively demanding data as a way to reduce responsibility, commitment, or investment. Okay, so I would love a takeaway just for this last one, and to get us into our discussion, a takeaway or a strategy that you could commit to implementing from today that we talked about with dominant cultural norms. Did anything stand out to you that you would like to try or apply a greater level of awareness or practice for reshaping a dominant cultural norm? You can also feel free to come off mute or put in the chat if that's easier.
Dr. Liu?
Yeah, Dr. Nakai, I have a question for you. The one that I really resonated with is the urgency or time limit. And I find that occurring very frequently, say on commonly committees that I'm on. And then when somebody brings up something contrary or needs discussion, the time limit is sort of invoked. And it's often sort of said, well, we'll do that next time, but it never really occurs. And so it just gets lost. And I was wondering, do you have any suggestions for me about addressing time limits when they don't really get followed through?
Yeah, that in fact is one of the norms we didn't cover today, which is disregard through delay, right? We just keep putting things off or telling people we'll do it later and it doesn't actually happen. And I think how we practice accountability with our agendas, right? Asking in the meeting or making a motion that this be the first agenda item when we meet again, or before we end this issue, like let's make a firm commitment or a specific date or a specific meeting where something like this can be revisited. And even just naming the dynamic, right? 3 times now this has been sort of put off until the next meeting, and I'm just noticing, like, what do we need to do to be able to address this? And then maybe the meeting isn't the place where it needs to be addressed, which sometimes is the challenge, right? Sometimes there is a different group of people or another context where that can't be where that can be addressed better. But yeah, I think having some accountability for what the follow-ups look like, especially in committee meetings, at least the practice of putting things that were punted to the top of the agenda for the next time, instead of at the end. Oh, if we have time, we'll get to that again, right? And then we all know that we're never going to say that we have enough time.
I think that's why, at least for the committees that I chair, in which I require minutes, and actually the only thing I really require in minutes is a column that says action items that need to be followed through. And they sit there until they get followed through. But so many of the committees that I sit on um, actually don't keep any kind of minutes and follow through examples of that. And so that's how I find things just never really get addressed. So thank you. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Kudos to you for being action oriented. Maybe that's a good suggestion for the other committees to just only keep minutes on things that we need to follow up on or revisit. Yeah. Thank you for sharing your takeaways. These are great. And I look forward to seeing those in action. Oh, and one shared in the chat, invite 3 perspectives before moving forward. Yeah, I like that one as well. So let me just go to the summary slide. So I just would love to,
I have a question
yeah, please.
about I'm really thinking about this power holding piece of it, and what is the best strategy to sort of deal with a situation where where you perceive there's power holding.
Yeah, so you're on the receiving end where your power is not being shared.
No, it's the other way around. There, I am not able to break through on on some requests because I don't seem to understand the power structure.
Mm. Um, Part of the hierarchy and organization that I think happens sometimes on purpose and sometimes by default is making it really difficult for folks to navigate, right? So there's no notes about who does what or who is responsible for what, et cetera. And so one practice would be to, in people's leadership profiles or organograms, um, we've done this for student services, right? It'll say like Anna Cosio, financial aid, you can come to me for, and then it lists like some of those things. So as an institutional practice, being really clear about what does the role of chair include, or what does the role of, ombuds include? What are the services and responsibilities that are provided can help people who are joining the institution navigate? Because then otherwise, how would we know that, right? The way that I would describe it is, if you've ever been a guest in someone else's house, or maybe you rented a vacation home, right? And you're just trying to like make eggs for breakfast. You don't know where anything is. You're like opening every cupboard. You're like, I don't even know if there's a whisk. Is there this? Is there that? Should I use a fork? An institution feels the same way, unless there are labels on all of the cabinets and drawers, right? That's better. And then you still might open it and still might not actually be in the right place, but you know that there is a reasonable expectation that something could be created. So, encouraging on an institutional level for more transparency around roles, jurisdictions, responsibilities can be helpful. I also, when I join an institution, really like to meet with people and just want to learn more about what they do. Right. So, hey, I'm new, would love to sit down and just learn more about what you do here. Right. What are the three most important things that you are responsible for? And trying to sort of create your own mechanisms for understanding what folks do. And often people are covert about that because it limits their work. Sometimes, right? Not knowing who's responsible for what means less traffic at your door sometimes.
Yeah, thanks. No, I think, yeah, I like the idea of asking to clarify what processes and workflows might be from the through the hierarchy, so that I have a better understanding of how a whole process works versus only pieces of it, which
Mhm.
sometimes feels hard to navigate. Thanks.
Yeah. And I'm a big fan of process maps because I'm visual. And so I've made, I don't know, 10 process maps for CUSM so far. But I think it's really helpful and mitigates a lot of anxiety when you see, like, oh, so I first submit my request for disability accommodation. This is what happens next, right? And this is who's responsible for those next things. Can create a lot of safety nets. If we drop the ball in what we're supposed to be doing, a person can know that we have, and or there aren't surprises, right? And it also helps us adhere to our process with more fidelity. Yeah. Larry.
I just wanted to give some assurance to my colleague. Over the years, I've been in 3 to 4 separate institutions, and all I would say is it takes me at least 2 to 3 years to figure out how to get things done. It's never in an organizational chart. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out who to ask. And a lot of times, quite honestly, it isn't the person with the degree. Sometimes it's their administrative assistant for me to get stuff done, but it takes me a while to figure that out whenever I join any sort of organization. I just wanted to
Yes, Dr.
reassure
Lu.
you.
Exactly.
That's been my experience as well. The org chart is of limited use in how things actually get done. Any additional thoughts or questions? I appreciate folks being here and participating.
Um, I think so as usual, I would say you've given me lots and lots to think about, but almost a little bit overwhelming. Do you have, I don't know, I can't say what's most important, but maybe what's most common. If I had to pick 2 or 3 areas to begin to make an impact on this topic, which I think is really critically important, do you have particular suggestions that are either common or most impactful?
Yeah. I love that feedback because we actually submitted this to Meta Portal as is, and they were like, it's too much. Like, it's too much. It's too much to do. Like, it's so we're actually submitting one norm at a time and planning to do a series. And the two that we're starting with are defensiveness and tokenism. And I do think that they I think maybe the most common mistakes and have the most common relevance in terms of patient safety and learner safety and collegiality and all of those things. And so we've actually broken them out with many more examples. Tokenism in the curriculum, tokenism in leadership, tokenism, so I'm excited for, to move that forward. It's obviously going to take some time, and we've sourced a lot of authors for each one of these to actually be able to get more real world cases, because that's what I think makes them sticky when we relate to them and we go, oh yeah, I've seen that, or that's happened. But yeah, I think just focusing on tokenism and defensiveness for starters, and maybe with students, I think the undifferentiated hypervisible perfectionism, the way that some of these norms impact students who are onlys and lonelies or smaller in number at our institutions, that disproportionate impact has a real effect on thriving, belonging, inclusion, and excellence.
I'm going to look forward to your series in MedEd Portal. It actually sounds like you have the genesis for a book, actually.
We'll see if I have that level of steam, but I think the reason why we really wanted to do it in MedEd Portal is because we want it to be really accessible. And it would be great if someone said, I'm having this challenge. Could I go and find a curriculum and some associated strategies very specific to med ed around these dominant cultural norms? Because they show up a little differently depending on, where you sit in med ed, and also just I think in society in general. Well, I think we're at time. So thank you so much for having me. And I saw that Dr. Turrell was able to join us. I know she said she was having Wi-Fi issues.
Yes, yes. I would be remiss to forget to say thank you on behalf of her. She had an internet outage, so she wasn't able to participate completely, but I know she'll be looking forward to the recording. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us for this session, for our Culture and Academic Medicine session. This is a CME accredited session, so you'll be getting an email from me tomorrow with instructions on how to receive credit for this session. If there's not any more questions, just want to thank Dr. Nakai one more time and thank you for her expertise on this interesting. Like I learned so much just participating in this session. So thank you guys.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.